let's start with having a look at what's changed. So with G-Cloud 6, my layman's interpretation of this on Diginomica was you seem to be asking suppliers now to mark their own homework when it comes to security. I'm sure I'm misreading that completely, but shall we start with a sort of an explanation as to what's changed?
So let me just check this on. Yes, thank you. Well, it's actually, there's a mixture of things that have changed. So the initial change actually came from the changes in the government classification scheme, and which my colleague Ian can sort of talk a lot more on. And it was from that simplification and change in government classifications and then that drove the output of things such as the cloud security principles, which again simplified the sort of areas of security that the government's really interested in for cloud structures. And that in turn was used to develop the cloud security questions within G6. Now you have to bear in mind the history here, in that prior to G6, it was there was a process called the Pan-Government Accreditation process, which, through no fault of their own, there was only a limited number of Pan-Government accreditors. There was an awful lot of suppliers. They weren't the only ones working. Well, basically, the Pan-Government accreditors didn't just have G-Cloud. They had PSN. They had other programs as well. So there was quite a bottleneck, and suppliers just weren't getting their services accredited quickly enough through that process. It was taking between 10 and 12 months. We had thousands of services to be done technically, so it was just not, it was unsustainable. So we reviewed the situation, came out with the cloud security questions, and yes, it's not marking your own homework, it's a transparency exercise. So there are 51 questions. We're asking suppliers only in lots 1 to 3, so that's the IaaS, PaaS and SaaS service providers, to basically transparently state what they're doing around security, and then and to state what type of evidence to support it. So it's like I say, it's not a compliance exercise; it's a transparency exercise. So it enables government suppliers to buyers to understand and ask the correct questions, and the information's there because it's provided on the digital marketplace.
So we'll assume that most suppliers will answer the questions truthfully and correctly and accurately, but it does introduce an element of buyer beware, doesn't it? I mean, you are asking buyers now to do their own due diligence as part of this.
Well, they always had to do their own due diligence. One
of the things though was you were supposed to be able to go to the cloud store and know that it had PAN accreditation, and therefore it was safe to buy.
Yeah. So, to back this up, so not only are they stating what they're doing, stating what type of evidence, if they have any, that they're using to support that assertion, but certainly kicking off in the next couple of weeks, there will be an audit program from the G-Cloud Authority where GDS will be doing sample auditing of suppliers and services to ensure that the information that has been provided is correct.
Right. So that's like a random sampling, is it?
It'll be sampled across the spectrum, because obviously, we've got sort of 19,000 services in 1 year, so it will be a sample audit.
Okay. So, Ian, when we were talking to you before about what you wanted to bring up in this session, you said that your description of what's happened is we've really changed the approach for the last couple of years from one of specifying generic security requirements to using security principles, and that you are supporting the buyers now to be able to effectively help themselves and to look at. Can you expand on that and just talk us through that?
Oh, gosh, this one is working. Yeah, absolutely. So hitherto, what do we have in G-Cloud? We had services with a PJ certificate that were labelled IL2 or IL3. So what did that mean? I mean, other than the fact that they've got a CSG badge, how many people in this room know what sits underneath that badge? What are you actually buying? Not many. And that's kind of the point, right? I think actually what it means to people is that these services have been looked at by competent individuals, and that there's some trust because they've got this certificate. But how do you make a decision between what's right for you between an IL2 and IL3 service? It was not particularly transparent. So you get some trust with those. But what we're really trying to do is we're really trying to to try and help the people that are buying these services to deduce what their own needs are for security based on their business needs. And then from that understanding of where their security needs are, then they can map that to services that are available in the marketplace and understand where that service actually meets my business needs, rather than just relying on a generic label that sits across those services. So that's kind of the fundamental change, and it does put a lot more emphasis on the buyer. Absolutely, it does. But it should have, that's an emphasis that perhaps should have always been there, where the buyers understand, obviously they understand the business. They need to do the work to understand what the security needs are. And we've published, you mentioned security principles, which is a framework to help people do that. So for cloud services, there's 14 security principles. They're not requirements, they're principles where we're encouraging people to deduce what your needs are. So for example, offshoring is a great example. Now, I'm not going to say it's right for everything to be offshored, nor am I going to say it's right for nothing to be offshored. Actually, it depends on what your needs are. So what we're trying to do is help give a framework for deducing those needs that then are mapped to services.
There is still, though, surely a degree of generic in this, in that you can't have a check out every single buyer, you can't help every single buyer individually, so you're going to have to create broad categories, aren't you, of advice and guidance on this?
Yeah, and that's where the framework that Tony has described comes in, where, because there are so many services out there, the starting point has to be the vendors asserting what they do in essence, and there isn't a lot of assurance around that, absolutely, but that's the starting point. It always has been the starting point, because in the regime where we had the PGAs checking those services, they're only looking at a fraction of those services anyway. I suspect that what we see is for those services that are very popular within government and looking after lots of our services, that a lot of the due diligence exercises will be conducted, that we put information into that marketplace to help further buyers reuse that.
So if we come to for the Skyscape perspective here, I mean, for a company like yourselves or a Memset or a Huddle, you've spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money making sure that you've got the right accreditations in place. Sounds like you needn't have bothered.
I think we've got to look at the history of G-Cloud. Certainly we've had 5 successful frameworks where being able to demonstrate the right security capabilities through the pan-government accredited route has been really important. It's really sort of put into 2 camps those organisations that took security seriously and invested in the controls, the people and the technologies to make sure that client data was absolutely always going to be secure, or as secure as it can be, against those that didn't really understand the requirement to invest in security as being one of their key features. So G1 to G5 was great. We had a great working relationship with Ian's colleagues down from CSG in accrediting our services. G6 has brought some changes. The changes are twofold to us. Firstly, suppliers have got to be really clear on what it is that they're providing to their customers. They've got to be clear on the characteristics of their service. Their assertions have got to have something to back those up. So it's great to learn today from Tony that GDS are going to come out and start sampling those. And we welcome that. Go on in, look at the suppliers, make sure that their evidence is there, make sure that everything sort of stacks up. But also, and some of you will have seen me talking at events over the last year or so, I believe that we need to be doing as much as we can to encourage the buyers to understand what that evidence behind the assurance looks like. It's important that I give an evidence pack that details all the characteristics of the connectivity, the security clearance, how I delete data when it's no longer required, where my data centers are, where my data protection jurisdiction is. But I've also got to try and understand what it is the buyers need to be able to consume that data. It's really important, as Ian said a few moments ago, to make sure that the customer manages their risk appetite to the services provided by their cloud provider.
So, can I just add to
please.
that, actually? I mean, so, yeah, a lot of work has been conducted on some services that already exist, and going to this new regime doesn't mean that we throw that work away. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden the architectural design reviews of services like Skyscape are no longer relevant. Absolutely they are, and they can be reused, but the evidence can be presented in a way that's much more meaningful against the defined security needs that the buyers have. So it's not wasted effort, absolutely.
So let's look into the dark side for a second then, and say there is the naughty supplier out there who does fib, and there is a buyer who buys something which turns out not to be fit for purpose. It has a security flaw of some kind in it. A public sector customer finds themselves in hot water. What are the penalties that will be imposed upon the provider who's provided inaccurate information in the first instance? And where will the liability lie for that? What could potentially be a loss of public money or a major data breach or some such?
So with the audit process, So if a supplier is caught under the sampling as to the information not being correct, they will be given a short period of time to correct the information to its true status. If they fail to do that, then CCS will have the right to remove them from the framework, because it's within the contract and the ITTs of G6 that you truthfully complete the security requirements and questions. Buyers will also have the ability to report any services where they've started engaging with the supplier, and if they start to engage with the supplier and and the supplier's just not meeting what they've stated, they can report that in to the G-Cloud team. The G-Cloud team will then specifically audit that supplier's services, and again that same process going through where if they're found to be incorrect, they will be invited to update and correct their information, because suppliers, well, not at the moment, but it will happen soon, suppliers will be able to go in and update their digital marketplace entries at any time with the latest security information. The idea being they've always got the very latest work, so it works both directions. If they're found to be incorrect, they'll be moved downwards, but if they're a supplier and they've upgraded, say, their encryption, or they've opened up some new data centers, they can go in and add that information in.
And in terms of that audit process, while that's going on, well, I presume that won't be made public, that you're investigating the XYZ supplier, because that's going to cause them to. But will there be sort of naming and shaming if they are found to be at fault?
Well, if they're found, well, it depends. Obviously, if it's just through sampling and they're found to be incorrect, and they'll be asked to change it, and like I say, it'll be a short window. If they don't go through that process and then they are basically removed from the framework, then any of their customers would be informed, obviously.
How does this all fit into the sort of the wider government emphasis on security these days? Obviously, we've got, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got the Prime Minister wanting backdoors for encryption on social media. We've got, obviously, an ever-present terrorist threat for which the internet and cloud is being blamed for its part. There's a lot more emphasis on security overall. Is that having an impact on this process?
Well, so in terms of our work, when we're engaging with these sorts of suppliers, we're doing so purely from a security of those services for public sector use, and that's the engagement we're having and with our colleagues in Cabinet Office.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions?
Going back to the previous discussion as well around cloud commodity, what we've seen in the change in the scheme is the true cloud commodity buyer. Say, for example, someone wants 10 user licenses. To go through the validation process is a lot harder than if they want to buy 1,000 licenses, because they'll bring in the resources, and it's just whether the departments have the internal resources to support, because the user, the buyer for the project or whatever, is not educated enough to take on all the technologies and work out whether they're right or wrong for them. So it needs to be someone with a solid background that's doing that, a class consultant or an information assurer. Do you see yourself the buying patterns changing because of this new regime as to how departments take on and self-assure themselves technologies for departmental use?
Well, ideally, all government organisations should have IA or security specialists. Certainly all the central government organisations have accreditors, and these should be the points of contact for any procurement or project teams, be they large or small. They should always be in contact, and any system or service which is going to be processing information would generally have some sort of what's called a CIRO, this Senior Information Responsible Officer, sign off on it. So there are touch points that they should be using, those staff and resources inside their organisations to help them support them in those aspects.
John,
Thank you. I think it's worth pointing out as well that Skyscape, as an example, we only sell to UK public sector, but we're dealing with both ends of that. We're dealing with the large Whitehall departments. We're dealing with some of the smaller district local borough councils at the other end. And what we have seen is, whilst the large central departments have a dedicated IA function, they'll have CIROs, they'll have accreditors, they'll have people that can open up and understand what an RMADS means and what the information in that document tells them. we're also having to be really careful that we understand that the people at the other end of the scale, the directors of purchasing for local councils, the administrative assistants in one case, where they're coming back and signing off that they understand the risk of putting their data into the cloud. And I think there is a responsibility on all suppliers, not just Skyscape, but everyone else in the room, to make sure that everybody is communicating clearly and ensuring that the customer understands what they're signing up to. Yes, the customer ultimately has responsibility for their own data, but we've got to do all we can to make sure that they don't misunderstand or not read correctly the information we're giving them to satisfy the characteristics of the cloud service they're consuming.
Which brings us back to something which we kind of alluded to throughout today, which is this whole idea of the educated buyer and the informed buyer. At the Tech UK event last night, there was much talk of the technologically illiterate buyer in government, and there were too many of those people still around, and we needed to educate a sort of a new generation. From your perspective, as someone selling into the public sector and selling, as you say, at both ends of the spectrum, is that knowledge A, there, and B, is it more prevalent in central government than local government? You know.
So I think we can answer that in two ways. Firstly, if an organisation doesn't have the IA capability to understand the information we're giving them, we strongly advise they go and get that help. They engage with the class consultants, or they find an IA professional organisation to come on in and help them understand whether their risk appetite is matched by the evidence that a supplier puts in front of them. I think moving that forward, it is a responsibility for us to use language that is as widely understood as possible. So, for example, under the first 5 G-Cloud frameworks, we had some very large documents called RMADs. They were very heavy documents. I'm sure my colleagues on the panel here will understand that not everybody can pick one up and and get meaningful data out of that. So that was a real heavyweight document. At the front end, there's the white papers that us and many other cloud suppliers are producing, which understands how we deliver against the 14 cloud security principles. But we also advocate, and something we'll be producing later this week, is in the middle there needs to be a bit more information. I guess some of you in the room will have looked at the digital marketplace for G6. Quick show of hands. Yeah, good. So you'll see lots of yeses and nos in columns down against the service. But what's behind the yes? What's behind the no? What's behind those questions? So we're asking all suppliers to sort of follow the work we're doing and come up with an evidence pack. Give the buyers, in plain English, the detail they need to make a substantive decision on whether that characteristic of the cloud service matches their own risk appetite.
So I guess I have to throw that open to you two and ask if that's on the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We certainly encourage that that approach, particularly from the consumer's approach. We encourage taking the principles that we've published up there on gov.uk, using those to deduce their needs, and then having the dialogue with suppliers to understand what's appropriate or not. And so, the approach of putting together that evidence pack is something that we would encourage for other suppliers. Actually.
Yeah, I'd even take that one step further. I try to suggest to suppliers that if you can put together a short 1-page, 2-pager, just stating what your security assertions and types of evidence, and then give a little bit more information about what type of evidence you'd supply. So, whether it's ISO certification or pen testing or whatever, so that the project teams and procurement have a rough idea. But then, as John said, put together a sort of a more detailed evidence pack, so when it goes to the next stage and IA or the security people in those organisations are involved, and you've got that more granular detail to give to them, and between those two, hopefully that should cover most of the bases. It's about providing the information to the right people at the right time.
We heard during the session on Europe and European cloud strategy, there was an allusion made to data sovereignty and to all the debates around data sovereignty that's currently going on across Europe. Buyers, as I understand it, under G-Cloud 6 have to specify where their data is going to be stored in terms of its physical location. How are you getting that information accurately from all suppliers? I mean, you guys only sell into the UK public sector, but there's a lot of, for example, American providers who are in G-Cloud, some of whom don't actually appear to have a United Kingdom data centre, unless we're now counting Dublin as a part of the United Kingdom. How far are you validating that? How far are you looking into that? And how important is it? I mean, it does strike me that something stored in Dublin is probably just as safe as something stored in Slough, but, that's just me.
Well, actually, sort of that particular element of the G-Cloud G6 questions, it's actually got 3 elements to it. One is the data center location. One is the jurisdiction of the company because actually, you know, under certain laws, the jurisdiction of the company is actually more important than the physical data, especially if you're dealing with Americans. And then the third element there is actually about the location where the management of the cloud service is done from, because it's all very well having a UK data center if the engineers and administrators and that are, you know, sat in China. So you really need to look at all three elements to get a true understanding of those sort of data sovereignty impacts. But when it comes to, you know, the legal aspects, especially, you know, data protection and stuff, you know, it doesn't have to necessarily be in the UK. You know, you've got the whole of the sort of ECC, EU field, including Dublin. You've got other countries who have data protection treaties with the UK. So, like, you know, like the Commonwealth countries. And then obviously you've got, you know, people like, you know, the US with the safe harbour. So, you know, it all depends on what legal and regulatory requirements you have around where the data sits. And unfortunately, law is somewhat hanging behind reality, because, you know, at the end of the day, if you encrypt data and you maintain the keys within your organization, it doesn't really matter technically where the data is, because it's encrypted and no one can look at it. It's the law aspects and regulatory aspects actually that tend to require it to be in certain locations.
Do you think the current push for tougher data sovereignty regulations from certain parties in the Commission is helpful?
Not really, because like I say, technically, it doesn't really matter as long as you put the correct protections in place. It's just a sort of a legal wrangling, you know, and around the laws and stuff. It doesn't really benefit you. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where you put the data as long as you've got the protections. Even, you know, Data Protection Act, it's really sort of Principle 7, looking at the actual requirements as opposed to Principle 8 about where, you know, having the requirements.
So at the risk of sounding a bit faragey, do your customers want British clouds for British people?
I can't do a Nigel Farage impression, I'm sorry. It's always been important to those that have come to Skyscape. We've always set ourselves out as being the UK public sector cloud company, UK managed, UK data centres, UK service management locations. So if the public sector's data is with us, it's within these shores. You know, it hasn't wandered off over to the States or to other unknown territories. So it has been an important factor so far in those that have, you know, I've been engaging with from the security aspects of onboarding with Skyscape. As Tony has said, I mean, it's down to risk appetite. If you're talking about brochureware or website content, which is, you know, freely available, in the old world it would have been IL0, we wouldn't have cared too much about it. If you want to move that off to foreign shores, absolutely fine, if that's what the buyer's risk appetite is like. But if it's something that's more important, if it's confidential data about, you know, the military or the structure of the health service or something really important in one of the central government departments, you know, there is still that feeling amongst the risk community that it's better in a place that you understand yourself, which is your homegrown nation.
So can I just,
please.
touch on some of the offshoring piece as well. You know, it's really relevant, and you know, Tony's point's absolutely spot on. I mean, you really struggle to define a globalized commodity cloud offering by geographical boundaries. It just doesn't work like that unless it's a specific, you know, UK-based offering like Skyscape. I mean, some of the big globalized service providers, you know, the data moves around incredibly dynamically, you know, based on factors as diverse as what's the weather like, you know, quite literally, because, you know, where it's colder, cooling is cheaper for power, for example. So it's very difficult to understand actually, you know, that where is your data hosted. I think where we need to start being a little bit smarter in terms of understanding some of those risks and understanding the controls that we're placing around those risks to manage them from a risk perspective. And of course, you know, absolutely, we know we need to be compliant with all the, you know, the various legislations, particularly the DPA, which is, you know, is actually quite complex when you start to use some of the clauses, for example, the model contract clauses, and making sure that you've got good legal confidence that they're being applied to that data as well. And I just, you know, kind of final thing, I just totally support the point Tony is describing about logical access to data. We sometimes view you know, physically where data is hosted and forget that aspect. It's critical because, you know, as somebody's probably got a greater opportunity to do you harm with logical access to the data than they have with physical access to, you know, particular segments or shards of data that are on some hardware somewhere in a data center.
Okay. Well, with all of that, I think I need a cup of coffee. So I'll just say thank you very much to Ian, John, and Tony. And I can guarantee security will be on the agenda at the next Think Cloud event. So I look forward to talking to you all again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.